This is a watch that only Casio could have made, and in a lot of ways I think embodies the true spirit of Japanese watchmaking. One which is solidly looking forward towards the future for inspiration, yet at the same time has its feet firmly planted in the grounds of tradition and craftsmanship. Because it's a watch that combines all the conveniences a modern Casio is known for, and I'm not just talking accuracy and reliability here. I'm talking all the extra goodies people love when it comes to the nicer G-Shocks, like tough solar, perpetual calendar, multiband, Bluetooth, chronograph, and a really cool, easy-to-use world timer, all thrown into a modern-looking design that's built with an impressive level of quality. It's the Oceanus Manta S5000, and it's actually the second Casio Oceanus I've owned. It's a watch that shows when Casio wants to, they can go toe-to-toe with any non-luxury brand out there. And even then, Grand Seiko's got to be looking a little bit over their shoulder, because Casio is using some of the same Zaratsu style finishing that they do. Now, I know a lot of this sounds too good to be true. And overall, this one's impressed me in a way few other watches have. But let's talk specs. The S5000 is a lightweight titanium watch that is 42.3 millimeters wide with a 48.8 millimeter lug-to-lug, as well as an extremely thin profile of 9.8 millimeters. And that does include a closed case back and a beautiful crystal clear double-dome sapphire, as well as weighing almost nothing at 82 grams on its integrated bracelet. And let me stress that again, because this thing is crazy lightweight. I didn't believe it when I first picked it up. On the back of my 7.25-inch wrist, it feels like a good 42 millimeter, maybe 41.5 because of the integrated bracelet. And the way the lugs are angled down before it hits the first link seems to perfectly line up with the curvature of my wrist. Then take that and combine it with the great taper of the bracelet, the very low center of gravity, and the fact that again it weighs almost nothing, and I can easily forget I'm wearing this. So saying it's comfortable is actually an understatement. Rounding everything out, it also has 100 meters of water resistance with no screw down crown, a scratch resistant coating, which is a real bonus here, plus all those other extra goodies and features that I mentioned above. And let me clear up the Bluetooth question, as this isn't a smartwatch. Like a lot of other Casios out there, using Bluetooth is just an easier way to set the time and roll time locations. And all of that comes with an MSRP that ranges from $1,300 to $1,800, depending on the colorway. Although that's MSRP, shop around a little bit, and you should be able to find this one easily for just under $1,000. Which I know sounds absolutely bonkers for a Casio, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later. But there are a couple of things to understand here first. If you hadn't heard of the Oceanus line, that's because until recently they were a JDM exclusive. Basically, they're one of Casio's top sub-brands. Not as expensive, but think Grand Seiko to Seiko. And the Manta here is near the top end of that line. So these aren't your standard Casios, just like a Mr. G isn't a standard G-Shock. And I actually believe they're made in the same factory in Japan. And with both of those lines, Casio isn't really thinking about affordable mass production, as these are specialty watches that are built in smaller batches to a higher standard. As well as when Casio's designing them, they're more thinking about experimenting with new ideas and pushing the limits of what they can do. And as such, affordability kind of goes out the window compared to other Casios. So I may still be crazy for buying it, but understand that there's a lot of reasons for that price. And before we really get to the details with this one, I do want to point out a couple of things. First off, I'm probably going to say Oceanus a few different ways. I have no idea how it's actually supposed to be pronounced. I'm not sure if it's Oceanus, 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 not a clue. So just bear with me with that, and if you do know proper pronunciation, feel free to comment down below. But the main thing, as I'm reading my notes here, I might slip in and out between the two. So again, just bear with me. And on a more personal note, this is a watch I'm really excited to share with all of you. I've actually been thinking about this one for years. I actually first saw it a few years ago when I was shopping for another Oceanus to review. But at the time, I wasn't sure I wanted to spend this much on a Casio. So instead of buying this one, I opted for the T200 instead. But after getting that watch, after reviewing it and seeing what the Oceanus line is all about, I quickly started thinking about this one. And more recently, the prices have started dropping. And that's possibly because this specific model may be getting phased out. It seems like the other colorways are still in Casio's sight, as well as a new similar S6000 model, but not this specific colorway. So I'm not sure if it is discontinued, but it kind of seems like it. Regardless, I don't really care if it's discontinued. I saw a good price for this one straight from Japan, and I jumped on it because I've been obsessing with it since I got that T200. And I was actually a bit nervous about getting this one, as I normally prefer my chronographs to be a bit more cleaner and streamlined, like my Hamilton Panda. And needless to say, this is completely different. But all of that angst and concern went away the second I picked this thing up. I was just taken at how lightweight it was. It really felt like nothing. And then I was amazed at how thin it was, while still having a good amount of depth and detail to the dial. Which then caused me to realize that it had all of that, plus somehow fit in solar, multiband, Bluetooth, etc., etc. And it was just baffling and amazing at what Casio could do here. Now, most of my watches, as I'm sure most of yours, are automatics. And I do love the craftsmanship that goes into a good automatic. Yet, at the same time, I'm still a bit of a tech and gadget guy. And those two aspects occasionally come in conflict with each other. And perhaps that's why this Manta just blew me away, as it honestly seems to be the best of both worlds. Don't get me wrong, the T200 I had is great, amazing even. That one is more of a normal quartz watch perfected, and at a more reasonable price. But this is more like next level stuff. This is more like what Casio sees as the future of watchmaking, combining all the modern conveniences they've built into their watches over the years with a fit and finish that most watch snobs could even appreciate. The hard angles of the case and bracelet design are a bit modern looking and unusual, which some may not like, but I think it solidifies this as a true sports watch. Despite the beautiful Zaratsu polished chamfers with clear and distinct edges, and even as good looking as this dial can be, the mostly soft brushed finish, octagonal shaped bezel, and raised Geiger looking midline of the bracelet keep this one grounded in the casual. And while a lot of those design elements are odd, I think they ultimately do work together, with each of the polished elements ultimately drawing your eyes right to the dial, while maintaining that unique modern look. And remember, this is titanium, and you often don't see this level of polish on titanium. Plus, it has that scratch-resistant titanium carbide coating to help that polish looking polished. Now, etched into the bezel, you have the city names for the world time feature, as well as a beautiful double-domed sapphire with AR rising out of it. Over at the right, you have a signed crown and the two buttons that you control the watch with. And the reason I'm saying it that way is because this isn't a normal movement, and it's more like a digital interface than a direct connection. The pushers here are great, easy to use, and have a great springy response. However, the signed crown is perhaps the one major weakness to this design. Simply put, it's way too small, and I've always had a hard time pulling it out, having to get my fingernail in there just at the right angle. And normally, on a quartz watch, this really wouldn't be a big issue. Just set it and forget it until daylight savings. Or in this case, you even have Bluetooth to help set it as well. But remember, this isn't a normal watch, and you use this crown for a few other things. Now, I'm not going to do a full-blown tutorial here, but I do want to show you a couple of the features, and that'll help you understand this crown issue. The S5000 has two basic modes, a chronograph and a world time mode. In chronograph mode, it works mostly like you'd expect. Mostly, except when you're not actually using the chronograph, the watch works as a normal three-hander, where the center seconds acts as a normal second hand. The top subdial is a 24-hour hand for your current time. The middle subdial is for minutes elapsed when the chrono is actually running. And then at the very bottom, that subdial has multiple uses. Like if you want to know the current charge level of the battery, pull the crown out, push it back in, and it moves to tell you. Although most of the time that subdial is there just to tell you the day of the week. Now, when you want to start the stopwatch, you push the top pusher. After that, the second hand swings into action and starts counting, lining up with the tachometer track on the raised outer edge. Meanwhile, that bottom subdial has then switched to ST to indicate you're using a stopwatch. Then over at the left, the middle subdial is starting to track the minutes elapsed, while the tiny one just below it is tracking hours elapsed. Don't ask me why, that's just how it works. Push the top pusher again, it pauses. Push the bottom one, it resets. It works like a normal chrono. Now, when you want to use the world time mode, that's where things get a little weird. For that, you got to pull the crown out and push the top button. And after that, that's when the subdial over at the left kind of comes back to life. Now in this mode, the main hands are telling you your current time. The top 24-hour subdial and bottom mode act as the same as the stopwatch mode. Yet now that middle subdial over at the left is showing you time in a second time zone, with the mini dial just below that acting as another 24-hour dial, but for that second time zone. Now, say you're curious about what time zone your main hands are set in, your first time zone. For that, push the top button, and the second hand then moves and points to the city it's set to. However, you want to know what time zone the second time zone is set at, pull the crown out, and the second hand once again points to that city. Now here, if you actually want to change it, you just rotate the crown up and down till it points to the desired city. Push it back in and you're set. Watch the hands spin and adjust as needed. And if for some reason, say you want to swap the two, and this is kind of a cool feature. Let's just say your main hands were set to your home time, and the second time zone is where you're traveling to. Then, when you get off the plane, hold the top button for 3 seconds. After that, they switch. So here, the main hands and the date are now showing that second time zone, and the subdial is your home time. So, a little complicated, at least at first, but still pretty useful. But I think you can see how that small crown can become a pain in the long run. Because as small as it is, it's just hard to pull out, I think, for anyone. And in a lot of ways, that's the one real flaw I see with this watch. But personally, I think it's worth putting up with considering how great everything else is. And you gotta admire how much functionality there is here in a pretty thin package. Usually, this is where I'd start going into detail about the dial. But at this point in the video, I think you've all been taking it in enough. And I think most of you would agree how good everything looks, so I'm not gonna do that. But there's still some things I want to emphasize here. Like that the second hand is lined up, or that the sunburst effect is subtle yet striking. Quite a feat when you consider there's a solar panel underneath all this. And also remember just how thin this watch is when you're taking in the depth of the design. That's also quite an accomplishment. The polish of the indices are great, and it does help them stand out with the dial with clear contrast. The blue highlights here are also fantastic, and I think they bring the entire watch to life. Especially the second hand and the blue frame on the bottom subdial. The logo here is also no slouch. And while I think a lot of people could argue about the usefulness of the two 24-hour subdials, overall, I think they make sense here. Because if you're tracking another time zone on the other side of the world, it's good to know if it's 3 a.m. or 3 p.m. You get two very different responses if you call someone. The only two critiques I really have here is that the date is a bit sunken, and it does make it a little bit harder to read at times. That, and for $1,000 or maybe more, I think the edges, the very edges of the hands, do have a few rough spots. I mean, the dial looks fantastic, the indices look great, but in a few of these angles, there appears to be a few spots on the minute and hour hand that could definitely be improved. Which isn't something you notice unless you're actually using a macro lens, so take that with a grain of salt. And normally I wouldn't care about that on a Casio, but remember, this is no ordinary Casio. Otherwise, as long as you can embrace the complexity of the design, I think Casio knocked this one out of the park. As for LUME, I honestly don't know what formulation Casio is using, but whatever it is, it's great. When you come inside, the hands have a nice healthy glow to them, and they are able to go the distance, easily outpacing a Seiko Monster, and almost able to keep up with an Orient Kamasu. And that's great for a non-diver. Luckily, you could also say the bracelet is great. Sort of. Watches with integrated bracelets are always a bit tricky, because if the bracelet sucks or it's just okay, it kind of ruins the watch. Now, this one is a little different looking, but it is very comfortable on the wrist, all thanks to its taper and shorter links. And perhaps comfort here is the most important thing. The bracelet's all titanium with the same level of finish, and I also believe it has that same titanium carbide coating as well. The design is definitely unique, and I personally do like how it looks. It reminds me of some old Seikos I used to look at. I think they were called the Arturos. And I do like that this polished midline here is recessed just slightly, protected by the brush sides. However, this is also where my third concern comes in, and it's all about how these links are put together. If you look at the back of the links and zoom in, you can tell that it was made from a couple different pieces of titanium. And I'm assuming they did this just to achieve this unique design. Now, I'm not entirely sure how they bonded these, and this may not necessarily be a problem. But I do question about how these will fare in the long run, at least compared to a normal solid link. These do feel completely solid, and there's no rattle or flex or anything like that. So personally, I'm not overly concerned about it. I mean, I'm wearing the heck out of this one as it is. But at the same time, I still want to point it out, especially because this is an integrated bracelet. And if you happen to like everything else about the watch, but this is a major concern for you, go check out the newer S6000. It has a very similar looking design, but has a standard bracelet you could remove. Although, before we move on, I want to point out one really cool feature I haven't seen before on a bracelet. Because this watch doesn't look like it, but it actually has an on-the-fly adjustable clasp. Now, it's only one position, but it is actually integrated into the regular pushers of the clasp. So push the buttons in like you'd normally take the clasp off, but instead just pull out the bracelet. And it slides out a notch just to help with the humidity. So a thin, small, compact, and effective design. And personally, I just kind of find this ingenuity pretty cool. And lastly, let's wrap this whole thing up with a quick word about value. And in particular, this one is a little hard to assess. Simply because there isn't any other watch quite like it. As I said, this is a watch that only Casio could make. So it's really hard to do any sort of real apples to apples comparison. Yes, there aren't many, but there are a few high-end quartz watches out there. But most of those are just simple three-handers. Whereas this has a ton of features you're not going to find from anyone other than Casio. So in terms of evaluating this one, it's really just going to come down to what you like and what your own personal priorities are. And I think this also goes for a lot of those more expensive G-Shocks. For instance, there's not a chance I would buy a Mr. G or even some of the special edition G-Shocks. I just don't think they're worth it over a standard one, at least not for me. But this is definitely more my style and speed. I love the convenience, I love the functionality, but I've never really been a fan of the G-Shock style. Now, at MSRP would I buy this? Probably not. But at a little under $1,000, I'm good. In fact, that's what I bought it for. And overall, I'm really happy with it. I think a lot of enthusiasts generally look down on quartz watches just because most quartz watches out there are built rather cheaply. But this is a watch that proves not all of them are, as well as most of the Oceanus line. And for me in particular, this one really combines the best of both worlds. The reliability and convenience of a complex quartz movement and quality craftsmanship, all rolled into a more stylish and conventional watch than, say, a G-Shock. Creating a true set it and forget it watch that's gorgeous and highly functional. It's one you can and should take anywhere. So I'm happy I got this one, and I'd do it again in a second. But what do you think about the S5000? Do you think I'm still crazy for buying it? Or will you be checking out Casio's site after this? Let me know down in the comments. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, hit some button, do something down below. Helps the channel. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time. I'll see you next time.